All right, big day today as we kick off the new year. Former President Donald Trump, his legal team expected to file challenges to all these ballot decisions that are trying to keep him off the ballot in places like Maine and in Colorado. So today's the day he's going to start doing that. In Maine, they're going to challenge the Secretary of State's decision to boot Trump from the ballot, and of course, Colorado decision taking that to the Supreme Court. It's crazy, Kevin. Even Gavin Newsom says these are kind of political distractions. Let's defeat them at the polls.
Yeah, Tom, Americans have been pretty clear they want to let voters decide the next election, not politicians, prosecutors, or judges. Still, some are saying it's their duty to take Trump's name off the ballot. By the way, that Maine Secretary of State, Sheena Bellows, she says she and her staff have received truly unacceptable threats after she barred former President Donald Trump from the state's 2024 primary ballot. That is not good, not something we want to see either. Let's bring in Roshini Rajkumar, political strategist, attorney, and host of the Crisis Files podcast. Good morning, Roshini. How are you?
Good morning, Kevin and Tom. Yes, this is going to end up a major crisis if the Supreme Court doesn't step in. I mean, we just can't have 40 to 50 of these, or, however many, dozens of these kinds of actions going on in different states. So I personally hope the Supreme Court steps in sooner than later.
Yeah, we've seen some state Supreme Courts step in various states, but it seems like unless the U.S. Supreme Court steps in, there's not going to be a clear path for the various states on this.
Right, a clear path, as well as just when you think of how we were laid out as a nation. So we've got the states' rights and the federal rights, the federal Constitution, and the federal law is supposed to be the law of the land, right? But the framers really wanted the states to have their own individuality, didn't want big states clomping over little states. So that's kind of when we go back to the original formation of our nation. Well, the states have different rules. I looked it up in Maine, and why the Maine Secretary of State did what she did is specific to Maine, that if anyone has an issue with who's on the ballot, they can file a complaint with the Maine Secretary of State. Then the Secretary of State makes that decision, and it's continuing on to work its way. It may go up even to the Maine Supreme Court. So each Supreme Court is the law of the land for that state. But when too many things and similar issues in different jurisdictions arise, then that is when the Supreme Court is there. And both, it was kind of accounted for in the United States Constitution in its own small way, but then over time, the hundreds of years that have passed and real practice has happened, the various federal judiciaries and lawmakers have said, wow, we're going to, this is popping up over here, it's popping up over there. We're going to stop any movement in the individual states, and we're going to hear it at the United States Supreme Court. So that's just a very rough, basic, non-detailed explanation there. But it's just the lawyer in me says this has to go to the United States Supreme Court. So if they're waiting on the Oregon situation, I'm sorry, not the Oregon, the Colorado situation, that alone, whatever they decide there, they might say, okay, now every state where this is an issue, we're going to kind of be that final decider. So it's a lot to kind of take in from a legal standpoint, but it's a mess from a practical standpoint.
So I don't know Maine's constitution, their state constitution, but does Bellows, the Secretary of State there, have a duty if she thinks that the Constitution, that she has to follow the Constitution, she has to take Trump off the ballot there? Is it her duty to do that and then see if the Supreme Court steps in or not?
Well, it's her duty. Now, I read an interview that she did with another outlet where she says our Constitution in Maine is very unique and unlike any other state constitution. I mean, I haven't checked every state's constitution, but according to her, the Maine Constitution allows for the Secretary of State to take up the issue of any complaints. I mean, if you lived in Maine, Kevin, you could file that complaint. She would have to take it up and issue an order. Now, she decided to issue an order and based her order on Section 3 of Article 14 of the Constitution. And that's when we were, the language you hear about anyone who engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States. So she based her ruling on that, or her order on that. She doesn't really have a ruling, but her order. But it is continuing. It could go now up the court system in Maine itself. So it might not be a final word in Maine. She's not the final word she's the first answer, but then if Trump's team decides to challenge it, then it could go up the court system in Maine. And see, this is where it gets very sticky. He can't be doing this, his team. I mean, there's so many things going on legally for him, federally and in different states. Now, if this ballot issue becomes something, now we're already seeing it pop up in Oregon, across the country, that's going to be a mess. So I hope the Supreme Court responds to the Colorado situation, which is asking for the United States Supreme Court to come in and make a swift decision, because then that could eradicate other things from popping up either direction, either to keep them on or take them off the ballot.
Yeah, and I'm glad you explained this, because what's happening in Maine to me was particularly concerning. Listen, Colorado, the state Supreme Court made this ruling, so okay, that's a plurality of people, legal experts making that decision, and that'll go on to the U.S. Supreme Court. But when one person in a state makes this decision, and she used the federal Constitution to base her state decision on, doesn't that necessitate that the U.S. Supreme Court gets involved to clarify what the Constitution means in the 14th Amendment?
Yes, I mean, it does. It kind of opens up a lot of doors. I think what's sort of confusing here and is that, the headline goes out, Maine Secretary of State makes this decision. No one really stops, and I applaud you both for stopping to ask why. Why does she have the power to do this? Her Constitution gives her the power to do it, but she's not the last answer. The final decision maker, even in Maine, is the Maine Supreme Court. But it's not going to go up the channels in Maine unless someone challenges that decision. And my guess is Trump's team is going to challenge the Maine Secretary of State. It'll go up the court system there. But all of it, no pun intended, will be trumped if the Supreme Court just steps in and says, hey, stop, halt everything. We are going to make a decision in the Colorado case, and then that will be binding. Now, everybody seems to be using the 14th Amendment, Section 3,
right,
to base their case. And I've been on the show with you guys many times, and Tom, you've stated it so strongly many times before. No court of law ever found Donald Trump guilty of causing an insurrection. Everything seems to be, some, he said, she said, he said, he said, or various circumstantial situations, right? So that is what I think would be an interesting point for the U.S. Supreme Court to clarify, because the Constitution itself doesn't say you have to be convicted of insurrection. It just says you have to sort of be either inspiring it or participating in it. Well, that can be read in a very gray kind of way. This is why we need the Supreme Court to come in and say something.
Yeah.
And then on top of this,
yes,
I'm just going to add one more legal layer. If you look at Section 5 of that same Article 14, it actually puts it on the Congress. It says the Congress shall have power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. So even if you use Section 3, that insurrection language, you still need the Congress to make a law for something like this. So it's a very convoluted situation, which hopefully the U.S. Supreme Court can clarify.
But you get that great headline for the politics, and that's the beauty of it.
Yes, yeah.
Yep,
and by
we
the
all
way,
live for the headline,
the
right?
only ruling that did come down came from the Congress, and the Senate acquitted Donald Trump of insurrection based on the impeachment that the House did back in, 2020. Very
right.
appreciate you clearing this up for us. It's so clear now.
Yeah, thanks, Roshini.
I can't thank you enough. Roshini Rajkumar, political strategist, host of the Crisis Files podcast. Good to talk to you, Roshini. Happy New Year.
Thanks, and I'm sure we'll talk again about this,
We
guys.
will.
Thanks
We
a
need
lot.
some more clarity. Thank you. 760 WJR.